Phillip. In this video, we're going to talk about Sigmund Freud's book, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. So, in this book, Freud introduces or deals with a number of really important concepts in psychoanalytic thought. Right from the beginning, he starts with the pleasure principle. And what he says here in the first part of the first paragraph of the book is, in the theory of psychoanalysis, we have no hesitation in assuming that the course taken by mental events is automatically regulated by the pleasure principle. We believe, that is to say, that the course of those events is invariably set in motion by an unpleasurable tension, and that it takes a direction such that its final outcome coincides with a lowering of that tension, that is, with an avoidance of unpleasure or a production of pleasure. So that's essentially what the pleasure principle is about. It is the idea that the organism or the person, whether it's biological or psychological, the idea is that the organism seeks to minimize things that are unpleasant and to maximize things that are pleasant. The pleasure principle is pretty straightforward in terms of what it entails. It's sort of tells you in the name what exactly it's meant to do. The problem is, common sense tells us that the pleasure principle doesn't guide all of our experiences and all of our actions all of the time. I mean, we can tell this from even a sort of cursory glance around. We all continually resist doing things that might give us pleasure, whether that's out of a desire to avoid punishment later or a desire to ensure that resources are conserved, etc., etc. So we don't eat all the food. We don't punch somebody in the face when they're being a jerk to us. We don't have sex with whoever we want to, etc., etc. These things might all theoretically be pleasant for us, but we don't do them. And so what Freud posits, what he says here is, under the influence of the ego's instincts of self-preservation, the pleasure principle is replaced by the reality principle. Now, this is the second big idea that Freud introduces in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, is the reality principle. This latter principle does not abandon the intention of ultimately obtaining pleasure, but it nevertheless demands and carries into effect the postponement of satisfaction, the abandonment of a number of possibilities of gaining satisfaction, and the temporary toleration of unpleasure as a step on the long, indirect road to pleasure. The pleasure principle long persists, however, as the method of working employed by the sexual instincts, which are so hard to educate, and starting from those instincts or in the ego itself, it often succeeds in overcoming the reality principle to the detriment of the organism as a whole. And so, what we have with the reality principle is a struggle over when and how. Sorry, I have a little hair in my mouth. Over when and how to pursue pleasure. The pleasure principle, again, is, it's the id in a way. It's the instinct or the drive that says, enjoy, 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 go for it, eat the entire chocolate cake. The reality principle is the part of the psyche that says, if you eat that entire chocolate cake, you're going to get sick and you're going to feel like crap. So rather than give in to your desire to have the pleasure of eating an entire chocolate cake, you eat one slice of cake. This is essentially the conflict that Freud identifies between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. Now, one of the issues that he identifies is that the reality principle does not always prevent does not always prevent the pleasure principle from getting its way, and there is a conflict created by this need to repress. And this is essentially what the reality principle is about. It is about repressing the pleasure principle in order to keep the organism in check long term, or keep the organism more or less sort of moderated long term. Now, one of the things Freud is really, really interested in as sort of a problem of understanding the pleasure principle is repetition compulsion, which is another important idea in this book, beyond the pleasure principle. Because repetition compulsion, again, kind of does exactly what it says on the tin. It is the psychological drive to repeat an experience, typically an unpleasant or traumatic experience. So, a pretty extreme, maybe, example of this is with PTSD. Military veterans, for instance, who have PTSD, that very often includes nightmares in which they re-experience traumatic moments from their service, flashbacks, things like this. All of this is the brain repeating that painful experience. And this book was published in 1920. Let me try and find it. I think it was 20 or 21, but I can't immediately remember off the top of my head. Yeah, 1920. He began work on it in 1919. So the reason that I mention that is because Freud worked with a lot of patients coming out of World War I. Shell shock was the term for PTSD at the time. And Freud dealt with a lot of shell-shocked patients, trying to work with them to get them back to psychological health. And so he became very interested, and he had experienced repetition compulsion before, because it's part of neuroses, it's part of various psychological disorders that Freud had worked on over the decades. But he became especially interested in the repetition compulsion after seeing it widely experienced by traumatized veterans. And so he began thinking about why repeat unpleasant experiences? Why do this? Certainly it's not a source of pleasure, and the pleasure principle would tell us that we seek to minimize things that are unpleasant and maximize things that are pleasant. So why would the brain take the person back to a traumatic experience, or why would they, like a victim who had been in a car wreck, for instance, might be driven to reenact certain behaviors associated with that? Something like this. These are the kinds of things Freud dealt with the repetition compulsion. Why do that? The pleasure principle tells us that the opposite should hold true. And so Freud basically focuses in this book on why we might do that. He discusses in here the Fort Da game, which is a really, really famous Freudian anecdote. Basically, he saw this child that he was living with. I think it was actually his nephew or something like that. But he doesn't say that in this book. But he tells this story in a number of places, I think. the child loved playing this game where he would throw his toys away and say, he said, ooh, or something like that. And they determined that was him attempting to say the German word fort, which means gone or away or something like this. But he got a toy with a string on it, and he would hold the string and throw the toy over the edge of his crib and say, fort. Ooh, he'd say fort, more or less. And then he would pull the toy back to himself, and when it reappeared, he would say da, which means like there. So it's the gone there game, or the away there game. And what Freud says about it is that this was the child's attempt to work through being separated from his mother. And what he says is, as the child passes over from the passivity of the experience to the activity of the game, he hands on the disagreeable experience to one of his playmates, and then, this is not related immediately to the Fort Da game. This is more related to, like, games that children play where they will, for instance, put another child in a disagreeable position that they themselves have been in. Like, where a child who has been shamed by a teacher or received corporal punishment in school or something like this will then play a game where they are the teacher and they do the same thing to others. But the idea here that's crucial is that the child passes over from the passivity of the experience to the activity of the game. So in this way, one of the things Freud theorizes is that the repetition compulsion is an attempt to gain control over the experience itself. It's an attempt to minimize the trauma and minimize the pain of the experience by gaining control over it and being able to run that scenario again and again and again for oneself. Another crucial component that Freud talks about, and actually a good portion of the book, the second half or so is really dedicated to this idea, is the idea that the other contradiction to the pleasure principle is an organic movement toward death. So this is what Freud calls the death instinct, or the death drive. And what he says here is, it seems then that an instinct is an urge inherent in organic life to restore an earlier state of things which the living entity has been obliged to abandon under the pressure of external disturbing forces. That is, it is a kind of organic elasticity, or to put it another way, the expression of the inertia inherent in organic life. Now, one thing that is really important to note with this idea of the death drive is that in this book, Freud is largely basing this theory on biological principles. But this is the biology of 1920. So it's not necessarily super accurate. So, for instance, Freud suggests that the basis of evolution is changes in external forces, or changes in external factors, that there would be, that evolution would not occur. There would be no drive for evolution if there were not changes to the environment that force an organism to shift something about themselves. To a certain extent, that's right. External changes, external factors are a major element in driving evolution because it changes the characteristics that are most beneficial to an organism's survival and reproduction. But another big driver of evolution is random mutation. If an organism experiences a mutation that gives it a an evolutionary advantage, then it's more likely to survive and pass on its genes through reproduction, etc., etc. So, while it's not necessarily wrong to say that external forces can excite or catalyze evolution, it's also not accurate to say that without changes to those external forces, evolution would not have occurred. So, the death drive, or the death instinct, basically the idea that Freud has here is that the fundamental movement of an organism is toward a simpler state of affairs. That not as species necessarily, but as individual organisms, we seek an inorganic state. More broadly, I think, or perhaps more accurately, we could say that the death drive really consists in a willingness to undercut one's own success in certain circumstances. Sometimes the death drive is stronger than others. Sometimes we do things that undermine our ability to be successful, and sometimes we don't as much. But I would argue that, and Freud doesn't necessarily make this argument. He introduces the idea of the death drive and then basically spends about 25 pages or so talking biology. And again, this is biology that existed by 1920 when he wrote the book, 1919 when he started writing the book, whatever it is. But I would argue that the death drive is not in contradiction to the pleasure principle or the reality principle, especially because, again, the one of the things that the reality principle often seeks to do is to establish equilibrium or stability. The pleasure principle seeks excess. The death drive, if anything, seeks a sort of regression into a simpler stage. It seeks failure, etc., etc. The reality principle is the thing I would say that balances those two. That by maintaining a sort of equilibrium where things are not excessive in either direction, the reality principle allows the organism to maintain its function.